Now, chances are, if you've played fantasy football this year, your wide receiver position has been affected by either injuries or bye weeks. Now, as much as I would like to, I can't turn injuries off, but I can tell you that you don't have to worry about bye weeks in week 8. So here's my quick and dirty top 36 wide receivers for week 8 fantasy football. Now, before I get into the week 8 rankings, I have to be sure to cover some of my bigger hits and misses from the wide receiver position just last week. Now, when it comes to hits, we had the likes of Garrett Wilson, DK Metcalf, Terry McLaurin, and all of them basically finished where we had them ranked just last week. But I had some pretty big misses as well. Brian Thomas Jr., T. Higgins, and Malik Neighbors. For Brian Thomas Jr. and T. Higgins, I did not have them ranked high enough in my week 7 rankings. For Malik Neighbors, I had him ranked way too high. The matchup wasn't horrible, but Daniel Jones was, so I missed on Malik Neighbors last week as well. But that's all right, positive vibes heading into week 8. So let's go ahead and bring up the tier 1 rankings here for the wide receiver position. And in tier 1, I got the likes of Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Tyreek Hill, AJ Brown, CeeDee Lamb, Drake London, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Jaden Reed. And we see Jamar Chase right here at the top of the list with a matchup going up against Philadelphia, the current wide receiver 1 overall in fantasy football. He's had at least 15 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games, touchdowns in 4 of his last 5 games as well, and now gets a great matchup going up against Philadelphia, who's easier to throw on than run on. Philadelphia allows almost 30 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so Jamar Chase number 1. Number 2, it's Justin Jefferson going up against the Rams. He's been hot this year to start off. He's had at least 12 fantasy points in every single game this season, and has had at least 17 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5. Then with a matchup going up against the Rams, they allow 25 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so Jefferson's at number 2. Number 3, it's Tyreek Hill. He's back near the top in a matchup going up against Arizona, and it sounds like we're going to have Tua Tagovailoa back. Tyreek has already come out and said, the band is back, start him this week in fantasy football, and I think we're going to listen to the Cheetah in a matchup going up against Arizona, who allows the 7th most fantasy points per game at almost 30 points per game to opposing wide receivers. Then we have AJ Brown going up against Cincinnati. Now, AJ has been pretty consistent this season thus far. He's played in 3 games. He's averaging just over 100 yards per game and has a touchdown in all 3 games that he's played. We also know that Dallas Goedert is questionable right now, and Cincinnati allows 25 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers in a head-to-head matchup going up against Jamar Chase. I got AJ Brown at number 4. Then at number 5, I got CeeDee Lamb going up against San Francisco. He's coming off the bye week, and no, he hasn't been killing it here as of late, but the volume is still there. 8+ targets in 3 straight games, and his yards per reception is currently at a career high. He just needs to find the end zone. He needs some touchdowns. In a matchup going up against San Francisco, they allow 24 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and Brandon Cooks is still on IR. After Lamb, we got Drake London going up against Tampa Bay, and he is in for another big day against the Bucs, who are just absolutely decimated with injuries right now. In their matchup 3 weeks ago, London had 12 catches for 154 yards and a touchdown. Really, my biggest concern here is that Atlanta gets an early lead and Tampa Bay can't keep pace. If that happens, Atlanta's going to run the ball a lot and lower the ceiling of Drake London. Then we go down to Amon-Ra St. Brown going up against Tennessee. And I know the yardage is lower than a lot of people want it to be, but having a touchdown in 4 straight games is definitely helping. Now we know we do not have Jameson Williams for the next couple of weeks. In a matchup going up against Tennessee, who allows the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, I'm not as worried because Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to eat out of the slot. Which takes us to our last player in tier 1. It's Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers going up against Jacksonville, and he's coming off his worst game of the season, but he missed a huge catch because he could not control the ball all the way to the ground. But the more important thing is the big play chances are still there, and now he gets a great matchup going up against Jacksonville, who allows the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Now, before we dive into tier 2, I want to address something I've seen a lot in the comment section here as of late. I see so many people leaving comments that they're in leagues that just aren't very much fun, or they can't ever get any trades done, or no one talks to each other. That right there is the worst way to experience fantasy football. If you're looking to join a community of a bunch of like-minded people in a positive environment, something that's not toxic online, consider becoming a channel member. Now, you do that by hitting the join button here right underneath the video, but more importantly, by doing that, you get access to our Discord. Our Discord is full of people that just want to enjoy the game of of fantasy football. It's a toxic-free environment, and there's plenty of opportunities for you to join a league with other people that actually want to be involved in the game. So if that's something you're looking for, like I said, consider hitting the join button here right underneath the video. You'll also get bonus content, a members-only live stream, flex rankings, defense rankings, kicker rankings, and so much more. So even though the season's halfway over, there's never been a better time to officially join Headliner Nation. But alright, back to the rankings, back to Tier 2. And in Tier 2, we see Cooper Kupp, Malik Neighbors, DJ Moore, Zay Flowers, Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, and T. Higgins. Now for Cooper Kupp, he's got a matchup this week going up against Minnesota. He's finally back, and he's in line for a crazy target share. We all know that he is Matthew Stafford's binky, and no team allows more fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers than the Minnesota Vikings. There's really only one reason why Cooper Kupp isn't up inside Tier 1, and it's the chance that coming back in his first game is a little bit higher likelihood of re-injury. But like we started the show off with, we're keeping them positive vibes here in the wide receiver ranking, so let's hope for Cooper Kupp in Tier 1 next week. Then we got Malik Neighbors going up against Pittsburgh, coming off his worst game of the season because his quarterback play was just that bad. Now he gets a tougher matchup going up against Pittsburgh. He needs big time volume because the touchdowns really aren't going to be there. Now Pittsburgh does allow the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but with the volume he's seen, we're hoping for a couple of big plays. Then we go down to DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears going up against Washington. He's coming off his bye week, and I really expected more from him in his game against Jacksonville prior to the bye week, but Keenan Allen damn near stole all of it. The biggest problem here with Chicago is the amount of weapons they have each and every week. This is a great matchup though. Washington allows the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so I'm hoping for DJ Moore's turn in week 8. Then we go down to Zay Flowers going up against Cleveland. And this one right here is a weird situation. He turned his ankle in week 7, but kept playing in more of a decoy type role and now is questionable to play. But I have to think that if it was that serious, they wouldn't have kept him in the game last week. Now, if he doesn't play, it'll be a whole lot more Rashad Bateman and Mark Andrews, but Cleveland does allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. So if he's healthy and he's playing, I love the matchup. Then we're going down to Stephon Diggs going up against Indianapolis. Now, we've seen Diggs go up against the Colts before, back in week 1, and he had 2 touchdowns in that game. Now with no Nico, could he do it again? The Colts allow almost 26 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and Houston really needs a get-right game. Then we go down to Devontae Adams going up against the Patriots. In his first game as a Jet, he saw 9 targets, so we know going forward the volume is going to be there, but now we get a little bit of a better matchup this week going up against New England, who allows 28 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. At some point, you have to think the big game is coming between him and Aaron Rodgers. Then, to round out Tier 2, we have T. Higgins going against Philadelphia. He's really starting to get back in the flow of games and getting more and more deep looks down the field. He's now had 11 plus fantasy points in 3 straight games. Touchdown looks are becoming more consistent, and Philadelphia allows almost 30 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so T. Higgins inside the top 15 at number 15. So now we'll move down to Tier 3, where I have Amari Cooper, Brian Thomas Jr., George Pickens, Garrett Wilson, Jalen Waddle, Terry McLaurin, and Devontae Smith. For Amari Cooper, he's going up against Seattle, and last week in his first game in Buffalo, he only played in 35% of the snaps. However, had 5 targets, 4 catches, 66 yards, and a touchdown. Now you have to think heading into week 8, he's in line for a full workload. He is absolutely going to eat with Josh Allen in this offense. Going up against Seattle, they allow 24 fantasy points per game, and Reek Woolen is still questionable to play. Then we go down to Brian Thomas Jr. going up against Green Bay. Dude has almost reached must-start territory here by week 8. He's had 90-plus yards or a touchdown now in 3 of his last 4 games played. No games with double-digit targets, but the big play chances are there weekly. Now going up against Green Bay, they allow 24 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but they did play pretty well against Houston last week. Then we go down to George Pickens going up against the Giants. Has the George Pickens breakout finally started here in 2024 with Russell Wilson under center? It's going to be the best passing quarterback that George Pickens has ever had. Now, yes, it did take some circus-esque catches in week 7, but that's what George Pickens does. We've seen that a lot from him in the past, and the Giants are really a middle-of-the-pack defense against opposing wide receivers. Then we go down to Garrett Wilson going up against the Patriots, and with Davante Adams in the mix, we still saw Garrett Wilson get 9 targets last week, which is a great sign. The volume is going to be there, but now with lesser defensive attention. In a better matchup this week going up against New England, I got Garrett Wilson at 19. Then we go down to number 20, and this is where I have Jalen Waddle, who has climbed the rankings in a matchup going up against Arizona because of the potential return of Tua Tagovailoa, who would be a sight for sore eyes for all them Jalen Waddle owners out there, because Waddle was basically non-existent without Tua. Now a great matchup going up against Arizona, who allows almost 30 fantasy points per game, and he gets his quarterback back. I got Jalen Waddle at number 20. Then we go down to Terry McLaurin going up against Chicago. And how do things change in this offense if it's Marcus Mariota and not Jaden Daniels here in week 8? We've seen Terry McLaurin have 11 plus fantasy points now in 5 straight games, 4 touchdowns over his last 5, and now he gets a potential shootout going up against Chicago, 2 offenses that have been putting up a ton of points. Now, Chicago also allows the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, and that's why I've dropped Terry down a few spots to 21. Then at 22, we have Devontae Smith going up against Cincinnati. And I don't know what the hell that was in week 7. 1 catch for -2 yards against the Giants. It's dropped Devontae Smith down to the wide receiver 39 overall on the year, where he's averaging right around 10 fantasy points per game. We all know that A.J. Brown is still the alpha, but with Dallas Goedert currently questionable, that could only help Devontae Smith. Then we move down to tier 4. We got Marvin Harrison Jr., Xavier Worthy, Tank Dell, Darnell Mooney, Chris Olave, Romeo Doubs, and Ricky Pearsall. For Marvin Harrison Jr., I need to clarify something. This is not a Marvin Harrison Jr. issue that we've seen this year. He is literally running wide open all of the time, and Kyler Murray just continues to miss him weekly. Now they have a matchup going up against Miami, a Miami team, like we've mentioned, that could get Tua back. If Tua returns and Miami puts points up on the board early, it's going to force Arizona to have to throw the ball for all 4 quarters. The only reason that Marvin Harrison Jr. isn't higher is his scoring is super inconsistent. Then we go down to Xavier Worthy going up against Las Vegas. With Juju out and D-Hop really unknown whether or not he's going to play much this week, we're in line for more Xavier Worthy. He just saw a season high in targets with 8, but only turned it into 19 receiving yards last week. He is still very much boom or bust, but it is a good matchup, and they're going to need him against Las Vegas. Then we go down to Tank Dell going up against the Indianapolis Colts, and so much for the Tank takeover without Nico Collins. It only lasted like a week. Tank just had a fat donut in week 7, which was an absolute shock to a lot of people. Houston overall just played bad. You have to expect better in week 8 going up against Indianapolis, who allows over 25 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Then we move down to Darnell Mooney going up against Tampa Bay. The best game that Mooney has had all year long was 3 weeks ago against this Tampa Bay team. And this Tampa Bay team is really decimated with even more injuries now, and really no reason for me to think that they're going to shut down Darnell Mooney all of a sudden. Really, the only reason he's this low for me is kind of what I talked about with Drake London. If Atlanta gets an early lead, I can see them running more second half of the game. Then we have Chris Olave going against the Chargers, and he is expected to be back this week, but there's also a chance that it could be Derek Carr. Everyone basically just found out that Alvin Kamara has been playing with a broken hand, but Chris Olave should be in line for huge targets with Rashid Shaheed on the IR. Now, this is not the best matchup, and with the unknowns at the quarterback position, that's why Chris Olave is all the way down at 27. 28, it's where I got Romeo Doubs of the Green Bay Packers going up against Jacksonville. And he's really regained that number 2 wide receiver spot here in Green Bay. He has a touchdown or 90 plus yards now in back-to-back games. He actually just saw 10 targets last week against Houston, and now gets an even better matchup going up against Jacksonville, who allows the 4th most fantasy points per game. Then we round out tier 4 with Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers going up against Dallas. And now that we know we have no Brandon Ayuk, we know that Debo is questionable with pneumonia, Jennings is questionable with a hip injury, and Kittle is questionable with a sprained foot, we could be seeing a whole lot of Ricky Pearsall here in week 8. The biggest issue is we really have no idea for sure what we're going to have in San Francisco this week. Now, going up against Dallas, they allow 26.5 fantasy points per game, but this one is all about opportunity as of right now for Ricky Pearsall, which only leaves us tier 5, where we have Keon Coleman, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Keenan Allen, Wan'Dale Robinson, Juwan Jennings, Jalen McMillan, and Jacoby Myers. Now, for Keon Coleman, having Amari Cooper in this offense is going to be great for this kid. It's really going to give him lesser defensive attention each and every week. In his first game with Cooper in the lineup, we saw Keon Coleman go out there and get a season high in targets, receptions, and yards. And now he gets a great matchup going up against Seattle this week. Then we go down to his opponent in that game, JSN, Jackson Smith-Njigba. We have to think that he sees an increased target share if for some reason DK Metcalf can't go. But Buffalo is not some easy cream puff matchup. They allow the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We really need to follow the status of DK Metcalf throughout the week. Once we get to the weekend, if he's not going to play, Jackson Smith-Njigba could creep up a few spots here in the rankings. Now after him, we go down to Keenan Allen of the Chicago Bears, going up against Washington. He's coming off the bye, had a big week 6 with 2 touchdowns, but his yardage hasn't been great. He hasn't had over 41 yards in a game this season. He really needs touchdowns to be startable, and that's really hard to bank on in an offense with so many offensive weapons, so he's down here in tier 5. Then we got Wan'Dale Robinson going up against Pittsburgh. I got good news and bad news from last week. The good news is he's still seeing great volume. Had 9 targets and 6 receptions. The bad news is that only resulted in 23 yards with a long reception of only 6 yards. And now they get a matchup going up against Pittsburgh, who allows the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. After him, we got Juwan Jennings going up against Dallas. And we've really seen what this guy can do in a lead role in this passing offense before, if he's healthy, but he missed the game last week and is currently still questionable with a hip injury. If by the end of the week he's practicing fully and is 100% healthy, he will climb all the way up inside tier 3. Then we go down to Jalen McMillan of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers going up against Atlanta, and as of right now, he is the new de facto wide receiver 1 in Tampa Bay. Now he may not lead the team in targets, but he's going to get the looks down the field in a game in which they're more than likely going to be trailing. To me, the biggest question mark here is, can he handle the added defensive attention? We still have other guys in this offense like Trey Palmer and Sterling Shepard and Cade Otton that could see targets, so if McMillan's going to get some deep shots down the field in order to be startable, he's going to have to bring them in. And then after him, we got Jacoby Myers going up against Kansas City. It looks like he's coming back from injury this week, and we know that there are plenty of targets up for grabs in this offense. 9+ targets should be easy for him this week and makes him a lower end PPR flex play in a matchup going up against Kansas City, who is easier to throw on than run on. Which is going to get us through our quick and dirty top 36 wide receivers for week 8. Now, I'm sure there's a few wide receivers out there that you probably think should be a little bit higher. Leave those comments down below. Let's talk about it as a community. Because I can tell you this, the people who leave the comments down below of, oh, the disrespect to so-and-so, I just ignore those. When it comes to fantasy football, you have to have a reason for everything. I've shared some of my reasoning here in today's show, and if you see it differently, that's what I want to talk about down below in the comment section. So if you enjoyed today's show, do me a favor, hit the like button and consider subscribing if you haven't already. Now I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day, but hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, if you don't chew Big Red, then you.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headline Nation, we running the game.